Section 0 of Hokitika, New Zealand. The Birth of a Borough. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Beeswaxcandle. Hokitika, New Zealand. The Birth of a Borough by David John Evans, Samuel Saunders et al. Foreword. From Hokitika Guardian, Wednesday, August the 24th, 1921. At the meeting of the Hokitika Beautifying Association last night, what proved to be a very interesting paper on the birth of the borough of Hokitika and the nomenclature of its streets was read by Mr. Evans. The information conveyed gave something more than a fleeting glimpse of life in Hokitika more than half a century ago. It is good to revive memories of the past, and it is well to have the links with the past strengthened, from time to time with reminders of the history of those other days. The foundation and career of Hokitika has been of the romantic order, and the suggestion that a complete history of the early times should be prepared is one which the authorities should follow up. The band of early pioneers is passing away, and we are losing touch with the old atmosphere of those former days. It would be well to act betimes in chronicling as completely as possible the story of the stirring times which brought thousands to our town, and which witnessed the carving of a town out of the dense forest. Work went forward swiftly in those times. A very few months served to see Hokitika established. In the first year of its municipal life, the street expenditure alone was set down at £23,382, while the income from rates was shown to be only £8,000. The pioneers who found a way through the difficulties and dangers of the mountain passes and the rivers and streams to the new El Dorado were evidently confident of overcoming such small matters as finance to make streets. The road to Christchurch, for instance, was made in a remarkably brief span of time, and the initial cost for that great work, as it must have been in those early days, was given at only £150,000. Yes, there were giants in those far-off days in every walk of life, and it would appear we never fully realize nor appreciate what we owe to the sterling men who in those times solved great difficulties for us who came after, in laying the foundations of civic life here. It certainly was a happy idea to name the streets of the town after the names of the prominent men of the period. This is indeed a lively means of connection with the past, and the references in the paper read at the town hall last night in the interesting account of the personality of the men of the past, who in an official way were so directly associated with the fortunes of the town, proved quite engrossing. Especially is this so in regard to Mr. Sale and the late Mr. Revel, and it is a happy suggestion that their memories should be perpetuated in some way by a local memorial. The founders of the corporation well deserve to have their memories perpetuated. In the circumstances of those past times, their lot and task here must have been difficult and arduous. Isolated as Hokitika was at the time of its inception, great responsibilities were thrust on those in power. That they used their positions wisely and well, we may gather from the esteem in which they were held, and the smoothness with which matters took their course. Friends depart, and memory takes them to her caverns pure and deep, and a memorial will be an outward and visible reminder stirring the depths of memory as to the services performed for the public weal. Hokitika had a romantic beginning, and its past is becoming embalmed in the dreams of memory. Let us, with memorials and the records of history, help to keep the story extant, for, though varying wishes, hopes, and fears fevered the progress of those bygone years, yet now days, weeks, months but seem the recollection of a dream. End of section 0. Section 1 of Hokitika, New Zealand. The Birth of a Borough. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Beeswaxcandle. Hokitika. The Birth of the Borough, naming its streets. Read before the Hokitika Beautifying Association. Town Hall, August 23rd, 1921. It has been a very pleasant duty to endeavour to follow up the suggestion made by Mr. G. Davidson a couple of months ago to trace out the naming of the streets of Hokitika. The information gathered has come from various sources. Mr. A. J. Harrop of Christchurch has helped with some notes. Also, while tarrying lately in Christchurch, came the good fortune to be introduced to the librarian, Mr. Bell, of that city, and by him was given access to some of the earliest records of both the Canterbury and Western provincial councils, and by this means the information now supplied becomes more authentic. Hokitika, in point of fact, has quite a romantic history, and the task still remains of compiling that history and presenting a volume of unusual public interest. From the many volumes of works on New Zealand in general, a mass of matter could be collected, and the story of the town would be as interesting as it would be instructive and romantic. Hokitika is a native name, and was applied to the locality before Europeans came this way. Originally it was spelt Hokitika, and as such is recorded on the earlier maps. It is a word of two syllables, hoki, to return, and tika, straight, direct, in a direct manner. It appears to have derived its name when the native tribes were searching for the much coveted greenstone. The Hokitika River was the point beyond which greenstone could not be found, and having come this far, the injunction given by the name was to return direct, further search being fruitless. As to the pronunciation of the word, that given by His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales when here is the more correct, and embraces the two syllables as given above, but with equal value in sound to each, thus Hokitika. West Coasters dearly love their land. Westlanders do so in particular, and there is a quotation from Hochstetter given in E. W. Peyton's work, published in 1888, Round About New Zealand, which is quoted, as adapted, to suit our beloved Westland. Was it the ties of friendship that I found there? Or was it the grandeur and peculiarity of the natural features of a country appearing in its isolation like a world of its own, that attracted me so strongly? I cannot say, but I will still look back with enthusiasm to my stay in Westland. Westland was separated from Canterbury in 1867 and became a separate province. As leading up to this, Reverend James Buller, the first Methodist clergyman to visit Hokitika in his 40 years in New Zealand, gives some interesting notes. But Mr. Buller was not the first priest here. He gives that distinction to the Roman Catholic clergy, though the name of the priest is not mentioned. Mr. Buller, however, was the first horseman to cross the mountains and make direct for Hokitika. He took 6 days to accomplish the journey, and mentioned he had to cross the Teramako River 26 times. Mr. Buller was the pioneer to prepare the way for the Reverend Harper, who was appointed to Hokitika and came later by sea. Speaking of the gold find here in 1865, Mr. Buller comments, "Nothing populates a waste howling wilderness like gold." When Mr. Buller debauched on the ocean beach at the Teramako, he found a stampede of miners going north to a new rush at Greymouth. The beach was alive with men, pack horses, and teams tearing north. Speaking of Hokitika as he found it at the time of his advent, he says he came to the river, and there found a mushroom sort of a town on the north bank. The forest reached to the water's edge. The houses were on the sandy beach. Revel Street, a mile long, was a succession of stores and hotels, the latter so called. Afterwards, Reverend Buller writes of visiting Te Kaniera. It might be of interest to record that Mr. Buller, while in Hokitika, was the guest of Mr. Alcorn, and slept on a bed under the shop counter. Alcorn's corner is now the vacant site opposite Mr. E. J. Lloyd's store, and now separated from the Don's store by a right-of-way to the sea beach. Reverend Buller held the first church service in the Corinthian Hall, then a building without floor, seats, or windows. Afterwards it was a drapery emporium, then the citadel of the Salvation Army, and latterly a private residence. In Reverend Buller's time, Thatcher, a local entertainer, held forth every evening, the admission being 1 shilling. Entrance was through the bar of the hotel. On the Sundays the shops were open for business, and the first church service was announced by the bellman. There was not a large congregation at the morning service, but the evening service was well attended. Writing of the town when his book was prepared for publication, Reverend Buller says as he left it, after his second visit, it was in the first stage of the transformation of a permanent and prosperous town, which now enjoys all the advantages of an organized community, churches, schools, and other institutions. A reference has been made to Mr. Peyton's work. This gentleman offers his opinion on the East and West Coast Railway, which is instructive to reprint as showing the point of view in the brave old days on the subject in question. Some of the people appear to think the first thing a new colony wants is railways, and are trying to get a railway constructed from Springfield to Hokitika through the wonderful mountains and gorges. There is already good communication by sea, and nothing whatever to warrant the enormous expenditure that a railway would cost, both to construct and repair. I sincerely hope that these ridiculous people may not be permitted to increase the already enormous debt of the colony for such a purpose. It is interesting to note that at this moment Canterbury and Westland are alike hungering for the completion of the East and West Coast Railway. Other times, other views. The birth of the borough. The borough of Hokitika was asked for by petition dated April 22nd, 1866, addressed to His Honour Samuel Beeley, Superintendent of Canterbury. The provincial secretary at that time was Edward Jolly, Esquire. The petition set out that there was a population of at least 2,000 householders, that answering the prayer of the petition would conduce to the welfare and advantage of the town. Some 157 signatures were appended to the petition, but of these the only two known to be surviving are Mr. John Solomon, now of Sydney, and Mr. Hugh Cassidy, Cobb and Company, of Springfield. On May 30th, 1886, the proclamation of the Borough of Hokitika was gazetted, the area consisting of 2 square miles, one on the south side of the river and one on the north side. On June 27th, 1866, at 4 p.m., a public meeting was held at the Prince of Wales Opera House, where Keller's sample rooms now stand next to Perry and Company, to elect 2 persons to act as assessors at the election of the first municipal council, and for the purpose of nominating candidates for the Hokitika Municipal Council. The gazetted advertisement convening the foregoing meeting was signed by Messrs. Prosser, Bonar, Reeves, Bracken, Munro, Wagner, Hall, and Finlay and Company. Mr. George Samuel Sale was appointed chairman to preside at any meeting called to elect the first municipal council. Those duly elected on November the 6th, 1866 were John Russell Anderson, merchant; James Alexander Bonar, merchant; Francis Leake Clark, merchant; Andrew Cumming, storekeeper; Robert Ecclesfield, merchant; James Fitzsimmons, publican; Alexander George Hungerford, timber merchant; William Shaw, printer; Charles Williams, publican. And so the borough of Hokitika came into being. Cornelius O'Regan, a West Coaster, gave promise of being a West Coast poet. Of him it was said, he died in the morning of his manhood, but he has left some lines which vividly describes the diggers who rushed the coast and helped to lay the foundations of Hokitika upon which the town has been reared. He wrote of the diggers, "Scorners of despair and fear, who roughed it by wild forest craggy fell, and through swirl of roaring waters, for many a year, daily faced the face of death, and bore it well." And of the times he wrote, one digger talking to a comrade, "What days of cheerful toil, what wild uproarious nights! What happy days, what glorious nights were then! Such mirth and merrymaking, such drinking and such fights, old mate, such times may ne'er come again." Naming the streets. The early association of Westland with Canterbury was a very happy circumstance in many ways. In regard to Hokitika in particular, the intimacy was of paramount value, for it resulted in the borough being well and faithfully laid out. Canterbury had its settled form of government and an efficient staff, and as a consequence the professional officers to do the duty of laying off the town thoroughly. It was laid off on Old English lines, with a generous disposal of special reserves and parks for the many purposes requisite for a complete civic life. We of this day cannot be too appreciative of the very admirable way in which the task was performed, and the complete thought given for all purposes tending to the common weal. The Canterbury official was of the right stock, and today and for all time the splendid service performed by those gentlemen stands as their lasting monument. In the naming of the streets of Hokitika, a very happy system was followed. The town is honoured indeed by having in the names of its streets the closest association with many splendid men who in their day and generation were outstanding citizens in the young colony, and whose work in the various walks of official life in which they practised was of special prominence. There were statesmen, high officials, medical men, and other high professions from which names were chosen for the various thoroughfares. Also there were squares, etc., named after notable explorers, so that the town has reason indeed to be proud of the names which grace its streets. It must be remembered that when the town was laid off by the surveyors, the streets were all forest-clad. As Mr. Buller said, the forest reached the water's edge. The importance of each particular street could then only be guessed at, but the choice throughout has been always a happy one, and the selection is in every way complimentary to the town. "What is in a name?" is often asked, and we know Shakespeare's rejoinder in Romeo and Juliet is to the effect, "That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet." But the happy choice of names for our streets gives them a pleasing distinction, and associated with deeds of the men who bore those names are marked importance, quite befitting the capital town Hokitika was destined to be. There are some 30 streets in all in Hokitika, or one less in number to be correct, because Haast Street is now officially closed. Also we have 3 large squares, averaging some 10 acres each. These public places all bear the names of men who, in some way more or less important, but always nearly official, were identified with the birth of the town and the making of Hokitika as a municipality. Our main or principal thoroughfare, Revel Street, was named after William Horton Revel, who came to Hokitika in its earliest days as agent for the provincial government of Canterbury. At the time of the rush, here Mr. Revel, assisted by Sergeant Borough, marked off business sections which were taken up with great eagerness, and thus in the Christmas time of 1864 Hokitika was created and blossomed forth as a town. The somewhat winding nature of Revel Street is explained by the fact that neither Mr. Revel nor Sergeant Brougham were surveyors, and in the demand for sections the work had to be very hurriedly performed. Hence the lack of perfect alignment which is noticeable in the other streets of the town, subsequently laid off with due form. On the proclamation of the Goldfield in March 1865, Mr. Revel was gazetted Warden and Resident Magistrate. It was on the 21st March of that year he issued the first miner's right on the coast to his brother, Mr. Henry Revel. After a long and useful life, Mr. Revel passed away at Timaru, where he died on the 22nd September 1898. The short street off Revel Street, known as Camp Street, was so called because in the earliest days before the forest was cleared, the police camp was adjacent thereto. There is a well-known photograph on record which shows the police camp and logs, as the watch house was called, behind where the Bank of New Zealand now stands, and occupying the area in which the drill shed now stands. Subsequently, the police quarters were shifted to the reserve in Weld Street, where barracks were erected, and a considerable force, including several mounted men, was domiciled there. Many will recall memories of the members of the force daily drilling in the reserve, and particularly carrying out sword exercises, for the mounted men's accoutrements included swords. The foot police carried batons in those days, and there were occasions when they had to use their truncheons. Off Camp Street leads Wharf Street, which, as its name implies, leads to the wharf on Gibson Quay. The wharf in the very early days was a scene of very busy activity, and photography has preserved for posterity many inspiring scenes of the crowded shipping moored along the wharf. The river in these days was used for mooring purposes well up to Cordegast's Borough, for near thereto were 2 or 3 large sawmills, from which many of the vessels loaded outward freight. A note: William Evans, Esquire of Timaru, the well-known merchant, in a letter to the writer, extracts from which appear in this pamphlet, states he was the first to peg off a section in Wharf Street when it was decided to open the street, and Mr. Evans actually named the street on the day he erected his tent in the first bush clearing made in the locality. There is another small street in the same locality known as Beech Street. Its name is associated with the particular location it serves. Now it is mainly residential, but once it was a busy commercial thoroughfare with bonds and warehouses, and extended much further down the beach, for the river in the early days made its way to sea very much further south. Hotels and eating houses also dotted Beech Street, but the locality suffered severely in one very high flood when the river broke through, and its ravages carried many buildings and dwellings to sea, the occupants fortunately escaping. Gibson Quay is said to be named after a waterman who plied on the river, but this has not been verified, as his name does not appear in the first list of licensed watermen published. But he may have been engaged as a ferryman prior to licensing becoming necessary. Many watermen were engaged on the river for years. There was the ferry to the South Spit at the lower end of Revel Street. There was also a punt crossing at the foot of Britain Street, near where the boating shed stood. In those times all traffic was by the sea beach, and as rushes broke out at Totre, Jones Creek, Ross, and further south, great throngs of men were continually on the move. In view of the growth of the mining south, it was decided to establish the hospital at the South Spit, and attached to it was a special ward for mental patients also. A regular boat service was established between the town and the South Spit, which became the starting point of the coach service to Ross. A considerable township grew up there. Later a road was made through South Hokitika across Wadeson's Island to junction with the punt, which was particularly useful for the crossing of stock, etc. A note: D. Stewart, Esquire of Timaru, an old identity of Hokitika, writes, touching Gibson Quay, it was almost certain that it was called after Captain Gibson, the then harbour master of Littleton. From another source it is gleaned a daughter of Captain Gibson is resident in Christchurch, and confirms the foregoing suggestion. Weld Street was one of the 4 streets of the town named after notably prominent politicians of that period. It was named after the leader of the Weld Ministry, Sir Frederick Weld, which was an office in the stormy days when the seat of government was moved from Auckland to Wellington. The Weld Ministry was defeated on the casting vote of the Speaker, and was succeeded by the Stafford Ministry. So we have the name of Stafford Street accounted for. In profile, Sir Edward William Stafford was of the Atkinsonian type. He was superintendent of the Nelson province and was twice Premier of New Zealand within 13 years, first for a period of 5 years and then for a period of 4 years. His biographer was very frank about him, stating, "He talks too much, puts himself too much in the foreground, and is wanting in suavity of manner." But behind this there was a large reserve of genuine public worth. He had a well-balanced mind of the golden mean, which is set down as being a rare and valuable statesman-like quality. His politics were moderate, and his administration capable. Sewell Street is another connection with a name distinguished in the early political life of the colony. Mr. Henry Sewell is described as being a man of culture and considerable ability. His conversation sparkled with cleverness and wit. He was happy in classical quotations. Also, he was fussy, restless, too easily impressionable, and full of false dreams. This natural disquietude taught him to be what he was, fertile in resource and skilful in evasion. The biographer concludes in this unkind vein, being fond of office and not exclusive in his political associations. Mr. Sewell, in features, was of the Gladstonian cast. By profession, he was an English solicitor. Then, as the fourth statesman of the time, we have Sir William Fitzherbert's name drawn on for the street which has become the main thoroughfare linking up the Great North and Great South roads. A great speech from Sir William, says William Gisborne, the biographer who has been quoted, was an intellectual treat. He was able and astute, the Ulysses of statesmen, of great debating power. Next we have Beeley Street, named after His Honour Samuel Beeley, who was Superintendent of Canterbury in April 1866, when the petition for the Borough of Hokitika was lodged. The petition, in point of fact, was addressed to His Honour. Hall Street was obviously named after he whom so many of this generation knew later as Sir John Hall. When Hokitika was laid out, the Honourable John Hall was a member of the provincial executive, took a very intimate part in the early fortunes of Westland. Ultimately, Sir John Hall became Premier of New Zealand. Britton Street, it may be justly assumed, was named after Joseph Britton, who was a member of the Canterbury Board of Education from June 1865, was identified with educational matters on this coast. Britton Street appropriately leads to the present site of the public school. Sale Street recalls the most memorable of names associated with the birth of Hokitika, or for the matter of that, with Westland at large. He was known here officially as Warden Sale, but he was more often dubbed King Sale, for he was a veritable poobah in those early days, being everything the town and district needed in the way of leadership and direction. George Samuel Sale was a native of Rugby, Warwick, and proved to be one of the finest men the motherland sent abroad to build an empire across the seas, for he was essentially an empire building of the most acceptable type. Mr. Sale came out to New Zealand. He is, for he still lives happily, a man of high classical attainments, and he possessed the fullest confidences of the Canterbury government by which he was employed. When the rush to Hokitika took place, Mr. Sale was transferred from a responsible and lucrative post on the Treasury at Christchurch to Hokitika, with unlimited powers to deal with all judicial and financial questions. Under the comprehensive title of Commissioner, he performed the onerous duties of Deputy Superintendent, Treasurer, Magistrate, Warden, and a host of other duties which came to his supervision in those rude times. Every case of sickness he cared for, and he was literally besieged by applicants for assistance or advice on all kinds of subjects. Also, he had to be his own architect. Supreme Hall, as we now know it, was designed by Commissioner Sale and erected under his supervision for the provincial offices, courts, etc., and this is another example of the variety of his everyday duties. A diversion in the narrative is necessary here to trace another aspect of Mr. Sale's services. It appears that at one stage government oppression from Canterbury led to an attempt to establish Westland as a separate province. A local committee went to work in earnest and prepared such a bill of indictment, a full statement of Westland's grievances, as was never before witnessed in the southern hemisphere. Hundreds of names were attached to the petition and sent to Sir Edward Stafford, GCMG, then Chief Secretary at Wellington, and to the Honourable John Hall, his colleague. To the energy of those two gentlemen, Westland was indebted for separation from what she then regarded as an evil stepmother. Westland was given a simple form of local government, while all this time Mr. Sale administered the affairs of the district unswervingly, and without his advice nothing was done. On being invited to stand as a candidate for a seat in the new county council, which had much wider powers than the present form of county government, as a representative of the borough of Hokitika, he consented, and was accordingly elected. Unfortunately, business affairs soon called him to England, and he was lost to Westland. On returning to New Zealand, Mr. Sale became Professor of Classics at Otago University, and on his retirement and later life, full of years and honours, went back to England, where he is still residing. Hokitika is becoming a town of memorials, and it is suggested that the life and work here of George Samuel Sale is worthy of some recognition, however simple in form that memorial might be. might it not be suggested to the Beautifying Association that a memorial oak tree be planted at the foot of Sale Street, and enclose it with a permanent fence, placing therein a tablet in stone, setting forth something of the work and achievements of Commissioner Sale in this town. In the same way, too, the association might mark the services of Warden Revel by some notable form of memorial in front of the town hall in Revel Street. Posterity, which has enjoyed so much by reason of the labour of the leaders in civic life here in the early days, can well afford to honour at least two of the men who at official positions did such typical services, affecting the foundation of the town to which we are now all so much attached. And so we pass on to Rolleston Street. This, it is very easy to decide, was named after William Rolleston, who was Provincial Secretary for Canterbury at the time Hokitika came into being. Like Sir John Hall, Sir William Rolleston, as he afterwards became, served well into the later years of his political life. A fine monument to deceased is placed in Beeley Avenue, Christchurch, in front of the museum. Sir William Rolleston was a notable figure in New Zealand politics over many years, and to his credit stands much land and educational legislation. Davy Street was named after Mr. Cyrus Davy, who was Commissioner of Wastelands in 1866 in the Canterbury district. Edward Jolly was Provincial Secretary to Samuel Beeley, Superintendent, in 1866, when the petition went forth from Hokitika asking for the municipality. From this fact, we may take it, Jolly Street received its title. Hoffman and Livingston Streets have not been specially associated with any celebrities in those far-off days, and it is not proposed, of course, to guess why the particular names referred to were chosen. Now comes a group of 4 streets, the names or location of which will be known to but few, even in this room. The streets are Harper, Dalton, McDermott, and Beswick. They are all adjacent to the Hokitika racecourse on the upper side of Hampton Street. Harper Street abuts the racecourse grounds. This street was not named after the first resident Anglican clergyman, as might be supposed, but after Charles John Harper, possibly a relative of the clergyman, who was Commissioner of the Rakaya Road District at the time the town of Hokitika was founded. A derivation of the name of Dalton Street is not clear, but Beswick Street was doubtless named after Samuel Beswick, who was the first coroner of Hokitika, or Joseph Beswick, who was Secretary for Public Works. The former Beswick is favoured because McDermott Street was no doubt named after Dr. McDermott, who, along with Charles Lloyd Maurice, appears to have been the first medical men here to submit their papers for registration to Mr. Sale, R.M. Dr. McDermott had his rooms in Revel Street, where Mrs. Roberts' sweet store now is, and Joe Sellers, still living here, was batman for the doctor, who was a very worthy and popular figure about the town in those far-off times. Note: D. Stewart Esquire of Timaru writes, with reference to Dalton Street, a resident in that locality, Mr. Michael Dalton, had a hotel in Hampton Street. He was a grand figure of a man. He occasionally gave Shakespearean readings. He was afterwards well known in Reefton. While referring to the comparatively unknown streets of the town, there are 2 others, or strictly speaking 1, for the second street has been officially closed now for some time. Harst Street and Ross Street are the 2 referred to. Both were laid off at angles in order, it is said, to facilitate the driving of stock through the town. Harst Street ran from Stafford Street at the intersection with Davy Street right across the town to the Ocean Beach, which was the highway north in the old days. The name was no doubt derived from Sir Julius von Haast, scientist and explorer, after whom so many physical features in the South Island are named. Ross Street crosses from Hampton Street at the intersection with Livingston Street out to Spencer Street, whither a way could be made to Fitzherbert Street, which became the highway north as the inland road was made. This street was named after George Arthur Emilius Ross, who became provincial treasurer in Canterbury when Mr. Sale resigned in April 1865 to take up his work in Hokitika and Westland generally. Probably the town of Ross was named after the same official. Tancred Street, it should have been noted earlier in this paper, was named after Henry John Tancred, who was appointed Deputy Superintendent of Canterbury in January 1866. Hamilton Street, so named after William John Hamilton, Collector of Customs, Christchurch. Hamilton Street led to the original customs office here, and the earliest photographs show it was not joined, as at present, to Revel Street. Hampton, Tudor and Spencer Streets cannot be fitted in with the available records of public officials of the period dealt with, but they are evidently the names of individuals who were considered important enough to be associated with the work in hand. And so we come to the last street, as yet undealt with, and in some respects those who laid off the town must have considered it destined to be one of our most important thoroughfares. The reference is to Park Street. It was not named after any individual, but was called because it led the way to the public park of something like 200 acres which the founders of Hokitika placed on the outskirts of the town's eastern boundary, and which is now a municipal endowment. In addition, Park Street leads past Whitcomb and Howard Squares, each of 11 acres. There are other educational and endowment areas along the route of the street, all undeveloped, so that it is clear that the thoughtful founders of the municipal area intended Park Street to be the main thoroughfare, tapping all sources for outdoor recreation, which should be the lungs of the city to be. Out of the public park, the Hokitika Racecourse Reserve was taken, and Hampton Street was developed as the highway to the course and the park reserve, though the latter has not been developed as it should have been. Of the two squares along Park Street, the area is likewise undeveloped. Whitcomb Square was named after Henry Whitcomb, the fated road surveyor who was drowned in the Terramacau River on May 6, 1863. He had been engaged in surveying the road from Christchurch. His name is engraved on the Explorers Monument, which stands in the Hokitika Cemetery, though it was first erected in Weld Street, where the clock tower now stands. It has been suggested that the Explorers Monument might be moved to Cass Square, but it occupies a commanding site where it is, and is in reverent surroundings. Mr. Whitcomb has a monument too in Whitcomb Pass in the high mountains, whence rises the Whitcomb River, the largest tributary of the Hokitika River. Howard Square was likewise named after a lost explorer, Charles Howard, who was drowned in Lake Brunner in September 1863. The exact date is not known, but it is known he was crossing the lake for provisions, and later the upturned boat was found, and some of his possessions, in the way of maps and records, encased in a watertight compartment, were recovered. Mr. Howard's name likewise is engraved on the Explorers Monument on Seaview Hill, overlooking the Tasman Sea, with the mountain landscape crowded behind, a not unfitting setting for such a memorial. There remains Cass Square, now the lungs of the town, and our popular playing field. This was named after Thomas Cass, who was Commissioner of Crown Lands in Canterbury prior to Cyrus Davy, named before. Travellers by the overland route also pass a well-known locality, likewise named after Mr. Cass. Cass Square, too, is to become the object of special attention by the Beautifying Association, and the members and public alike, while this necessary civic work is being done, should also feel that honour is being done to the pioneer officials of the past who had so much thought for the future generations by providing so generously for the people who were to come after them. With these thoughts, this paper may be brought to a close. The desire has been to stimulate an interest in our town, so that the citizens will pride themselves on its well-being. A long list of notabilities are associated with the naming of our streets, men who did their country great service. They were all men of splendid spirit. Longfellow has put it in his memorable lines from A Psalm of Life. Lives of great men all remind us, we can make our lives sublime, and departing leave behind us footprints on the sands of time. Let the lives of the pioneers inspire us, so that as a corporation we might see the town further progress, and be made more and more worthy of the honour done it by associating with its fortunes for all time the names of men distinguished in their professions and in their public life. Let our motto be, Forward Hokitika, and work and strive to achieve that municipal importance which will come from honest effort and unquenched endeavour. David John Evans. End of section 1. Section 2 of Hokitika, New Zealand, The Birth of a Borough. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Beeswaxcandle. Street nomenclature. Supplementary notes from the pen of Samuel Saunders, Esquire, journalist, Wellington. In its street names, Hokitika has memorials to many public men who have distinguished themselves by generous, patriotic and beneficial service to the district and the Dominion at large. It is well that we should occasionally recall memories of the pioneers in settlement and achievement as an inspiration and encouragement to all of us, and particularly to our young people, to go forward in their footsteps and with their high ideals and devotion to duty. I have a list of some of these memorable names before me this evening, taken almost at random, and I propose to remind you very briefly of what the courageous, far-seeing men who bore them did for you and me and the rest of the community. Tancred Street is named after Henry John Tancred, born in England 1825 and educated at Rugby. The great public schools by England did as much for colonisation in those days as Wellington said they did for the nation at the Battle of Waterloo. As a very young man, Tancred joined the Austrian army and saw service in Hungary and Italy, and came to Canterbury in 1851, and quietly identified himself with affairs of the young colony. In 1853 he was elected to the Provincial Council, then for the first time called together under the Constitution Act. In 1857 he was elected to the General Assembly, and in the same year joined the Sewell Ministry, having as a colleague Mr. Whittaker, afterwards Sir Frederick. He took a keen interest in educational matters, and was a member of the Canterbury Board of Education, a governor of Christ's College and of Canterbury College, and his association with the West Coast was largely in his connection with his efforts to provide facilities for education throughout the whole country. Sewell Street. Henry Sewell came to Canterbury, of which the West Coast was then a part, in 1853, and he had been closely associated with Edward Gibbon Wakefield and other officers who took a prominent part in promoting the Canterbury settlement. On his arrival in Littleton, he found the new settlement in a state of stagnation, and applied himself with great zeal and judgment to the task of putting its affairs in order. Remarkable success attended his efforts, and all parts of the country in which he laboured have good reason to be grateful for his services. He was elected to the first Parliament under the Constitution Act in 1853, and held office in the first ministry under Mr. Fitzgerald. Later he became the head of a ministry, but resigned rather than give up his demand for full responsible government. He was a very capable lawyer, an effective debater, and a highly cultured gentleman. Fitzherbert Street. Mr. William Fitzherbert came to New Zealand as a young man in 1842, landing first at Wellington, and a year later he was offered a seat in the Legislative Council, but he declined the distinction, preferring to devote himself to farming and trading pursuits. He was, however, one of the moving spirits in the agitation for responsible government, which finally won for the young colony the Constitution Act, under which it still enjoys its wide political freedom. He was elected superintendent of Wellington in 1871, and remained in office till the abolition of the provinces in 1875. Previously he had been elected to the House of Representatives, and filled the office of Colonial Treasurer, now designated Minister of Finance. He took a very active part in the removal of the seat of government from Auckland to Wellington, and again his efforts were crowned with success. He was elected Speaker of the House of Representations in 1876, and on retiring from that branch of the legislature in 1879 was appointed Speaker of the Legislative Council. It was in recognition of his many valuable services to New Zealand, which often affected the coast in an intimate way, that his name was given to a street in Hokitika. Beeley Street. Mr. Samuel Beeley was born in Lancashire in 1821 and took his degree of B.A. at Cambridge in 1851 and sailed for New Zealand in the same year. With his brother John, he acquired considerable tracts of land in Canterbury and his name is familiar in connection with a well-known part of the road between the coast and Christchurch. On the passing of the Constitution Act, Mr. Beeley was elected to the Provincial Council, and continued a member of that body till he was elected Superintendent of the province in 1863. His great aim in private life, and in the various public offices he filled, was to hasten the young colony towards the great goal to progress and prosperity which he believed to be its ultimate destiny. He did much to promote public works in Canterbury, and expended much by his thought and energy in developing the country on this side of the range. Hall Street. Sir John Hall was born in Yorkshire in 1824, and after receiving a generous education in Germany, Switzerland, and Paris, and some office experience as secretary to the Secretary of the General Post Office in London, he came to New Zealand in 1852 in the last of the Canterbury Association's chartered ships. After visiting several parts of the colony, he finally settled in Canterbury. He was a member of the Canterbury Provincial Council through the whole period in which the provincial form of government existed, and held several responsible offices. Among other positions he held were the chairmanship of the Westland and Selborne County Councils, and after to the first Christchurch Municipal Council. He was elected to the House of Representatives as member for Christchurch in 1858. In the following year he became Colonial Secretary under the leadership of Sir William Fox. In 1862 he was nominated to the Legislative Council, but at the end of the year he resigned his seat in the Upper House to contest the Heathcote seat in the Lower. Having won the election, he became Postmaster General in the Stafford Ministry, and in the rapid changes of ministers that took place during the next 10 years, he filled many positions. But in 1879 he resigned for the fourth time a seat in the council to lead the opponents of Sir George Grey at the polls. After the election, he became Premier, and was at the head of the government till the general election, when the stout Vogel coalition came into force. Sir John Hall's political views were not the views of many people on the coast, but he was an earnest, capable man, and rendered great service to New Zealand during the difficult days of early settlement and development, and his name shall remain green with those who are enjoying the fruits of his labour. Sale Street. It was Mr. Samuel Beeley, when Superintendent of Canterbury, who sent Mr. Sale over to supervise the Western goldfields. Mr. Sale was a conscientious and scholarly man, full of understanding and sympathy, did excellent work in the promotion of the gold mining industry and in viewing remote parts of the coast. He was subsequently appointed to the staff of the Dunedin University College as a professor, and continued in that capacity for many years to add distinction to a name which Hokitika is proud to honour. Rolleston Street. No name in the public life of the Dominion is held in more appreciative remembrance than is that of William Rolleston, the last Superintendent of Canterbury, and one of its most honoured sons. After a distinguished career at Cambridge University, Mr. Rolleston came to New Zealand in 1858 and took over a run in the forks of the Rakaia River, near Lake Coleridge. But the people of Canterbury soon discovered their need of such a man to help on their various public activities, and he was speedily drawn into the vortex of local and colonial politics. This part of his career, which extended right up to the time of his death, cannot be adequately discussed here. But it is interesting to recall that on the discovery of goldfields on this coast in 1865, he came from Christchurch to Hokitika with Mr. Seed, Mr. Rochford, and other officers to organise the several departments of government. They did much for education, for land settlement, for electoral reform, for the consideration of the conditions of the workers, and for any other beneficial reform that was dear to his heart. Though on the opposite side of Parliament to our own great statesman, Richard John Seddon, it is pleasant to know that these two big, able, chivalrous men were close personal friends, and that though they sometimes employed different means to reach the same, their devotion to New Zealand and to its people was their common consideration and the crowning glory of their service. Hokitika has good and abundant reason for honouring the memory of William Rolleston. In doing so, it is honouring itself. Weld Street. Sir Frederick Aloysius Weld was born in 1823, and after being educated at Stonyhurst College and in Switzerland, he came to New Zealand in 1844 with the intention of devoting himself to grazing pursuits. He also was a strong advocate of the concession of responsible government, and was largely instrumental in bringing this about. He occupied a seat in the first House of Representatives, and in 1864 became Prime Minister, after extracting a promise from the then Governor Sir George Grey that he was to have his own way in setting the grave native difficulties that existed at that time. In 1865 he resigned and returned to England, but his administration in New Zealand had so impressed the authorities at home that he was made successively Governor of West Australia, Tasmania, and the Straits Settlement. He held very extensive land interests in New Zealand in connection with the Cliffords, to whom he was related. His name was a great one in the colonizing affairs of the empire, and it is fitting it should distinguish one of the streets in Hokitika. Jolly Street. Mr. Edward Jolly, who did much exploring and pioneering work in the later 50s and early 60s of the last century, gave his name to Jolly Pass, the road leading from Hanmer Plains to the Clarence Valley, long before his name was perpetuated in Hokitika. He was in the House of Representatives for a single session of the Second Parliament, from 1859 to 1860, but he had a longer record in the Canterbury Provincial Council, being a member from 1866 till the eve of the abolition of the provinces 10 years later. He was chairman of the executive in 1866, 1868, and 1869. Both the opportunities he enjoyed, and with his vast energy and persistence he did much for Westland as well as for Canterbury, and the town has done well to commemorate his services. Davy Street. Mr. Davy was one of the chief surveyors during the early days of Westland and Canterbury, and it must be remembered that at that time Westland was part of Canterbury. He was distinguished for his conscientious perseverance of his professional duties, his ready resource, and his sound judgment. He earned the gratitude of the West Coast by the assistance he gave in the development of its resources. Hamilton Street. William John Hamilton was one of the earliest collectors of customs in Canterbury, and as in those days the occupation of such an office did not debar a man from entering politics, we find this studious, eager man as a member of the Canterbury Provincial Council in 1863 and 1864, and a member of the executive. His inclination, however, drew him towards outside work, and quite early in the days of settlement he found his way across from Christchurch to the West Coast. As that of an able administrator, a loyal friend, and a broad-minded man, his name stands high among those workers of history in New Zealand. Stafford Street. Between 1855 and 1878, Sir Edward William Stafford took a prominent part in the politics and government of New Zealand. He was thrice Premier from 1856 to 1861, from 1865 to 1869, and from September the 10th, 1872 to October the 11th, 1872. The last period was during one of the shuffles of the cards which occasionally took place in politics, but the other periods covered some of the most serious stages in the Maori Wars. His administration was vigorous and capable, and though he is not numbered among the most capable of New Zealand statesmen, he retained in a marked degree the respect and regard of his political friends and political opponents. Having first taken up his residence in Nelson, which city first sent him to Parliament, he always retained a keen interest in this part of the country, and Hokitika is marking its appreciation of the man and of his work by associating his name with one of its principal thoroughfares. Cass Square. No other member of his profession, not excepting the pioneers of the Canterbury Association, had so much to do with the laying out, so to speak, of Canterbury and Westland as had Mr. Thomas Cass, who for many years was chief surveyor of the Canterbury province. A man of exceptional ability, great courage, and power of endurance, he gave splendid service to the state and the province, and his works live after him in many parts of the South Island. Hokitika's tributes to this upholder of all the best traditions of his profession may be only a small one, but it is appropriate, and the one he would have chosen himself. Whitcomb Square. Whitcomb is named as a tribute to the discoverer of the Whitcomb's Pass, who had both a passion and a genius for exploration, and found on the rugged mountains by the Great Divide a wide and congenial field for the gratification of his bent. Whitcomb was unhappily drowned during one of his journeys, and his remains lie in the Greymouth Cemetery, side by side with those of Townsend, one of his fellow explorers, and George Dobson, one of the victims of the Burgess-Kelly gang of bushrangers. End of section 2. Section 3 of Hokitika, New Zealand, The Birth of a Borough. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Beeswaxcandle. Reminiscences by William Evans, Esquire, Merchant of Timaru. Mr. W. Evans writes, having read the newspaper article in the Hokitika Guardian by Mr. D.J. Evans, entitled The Birth of Hokitika, no doubt some early reminiscences of the town will be of interest to readers, and to those of the early settlers still alive who may read them. Strange to say, I was in Hokitika in business on the corner of Camp and Wharf Streets for a number of years as a wine, spirit and provision merchant from 1866 to 1874. And well remember Mr. D.J. Evans' father coming into my office the morning after the now Mr. D.J. Evans was born to acquaint me of the event, and to say mother and child were both doing well. Mr. Evans was a pleased man that morning. As the present D.J. Evans was their first, and, so far as I remember, their only child, I heartily congratulated him. He and I did business together up to the time I left Hokitika. We were always good friends. His wife was an exceptionally clever businesswoman. They were both much respected as honest, straightforward family hotel keepers. I arrived in Hokitika roadstead in 1865, the first year of the gold rush, by the steamer City of Dunedin. This steamer was lost after coming through the Wellington Heads the following trip. All aboard, the passengers and crew, were lost, as she was supposed to have turned turtle in the heavy sea running at the time. The day we reached Hokitika roadstead, the SS Alhambra, Captain John Maclean, was there before us, and there were supposed to be about 1,000 passengers on board the two vessels, all of whom were landed that day, being transshipped to the SS Maori, Captain Malcolm. At that time there was not any steam tug for towing vessels over the bar, and the class of ships then in use were mostly small sailing craft and very small steamers, many of which were lying wrecks on the beach at the time of our arrival. I well remember our crossing the bar on a fine afternoon in 1865, and the SS Maori coming alongside the riverbank, which was lined with trees and supplejacks, which took some time to clear before we could land the passengers. We had the new collector of customs aboard, and he lost no time in collecting revenue from the owners of any goods landing in Hokitika at that time. I forget his name now, but he preceded Mr. Patton, who for so many years represented Her Majesty's Customs in Hokitika. Directly opposite the landing place was a large tent owned by a German named Schulte, in use as a hotel and eating house, and so well patronized that it was difficult to get served with the drinks required, which were many, as the people who had previously landed from other boats and overland came down to meet friends they had parted with in Dunedin and elsewhere only a short time before. The late James Chesney, afterwards the well-known merchant of Wharf Street, landed from the Alhambra the same time as I did from the City of Dunedin, and as I knew him in Dunedin, he was anxious to chum up with me, as he had always been used to a town life and had no experience of digging rushes. He knew I had spent some years on the diggings of both Victoria and New Zealand. Within a few minutes of landing, I met some Otago diggers, who had camped on ground adjacent to the then landing place, and had pegged off a section of 66 feet by 132 feet on spec. We had the usual drinks after meeting, and they told me they were leaving for one of the rushes that evening, and kindly offered me the section for what it was worth, as up to that time no government sections had been marked out, so that no licenses had been granted. I accepted the section and took it over. I then had to look out for a place of accommodation for that night, and managed to secure lodgings from a man named D. Cox, who had been a storeman of mine on Dunstan Creek. He had joined another Otago man, opening a public house and dance room combined. We thought ourselves lucky to get any sort of accommodation, as we had no tent, and there were only a few drinking shanties and small stores at that time in the new township, which was composed mostly of tents set down anywhere. We had a rough night's rest, as the dance room was kept going until after midnight. My bed belonged to Cox, who gave it to me, but Chesney had to sleep on the floor. Next day we decided to change our lodgings, and after a look round I met Mr. McTavick, the inspector of the Union Bank of that day, and informed him I was on the lookout for a good business site. He stated the government were forming the township, and that there would be a street at the back of Revel Street. There was a section at the back of the Union Bank that was unoccupied, but it was all rough bush and scrub at that time. At once I went up to the warden's office, and Mr. Revel was the then warden and resident magistrate, took out No. 6 licence to occupy, and put on men to cut down the bush and clear the section, and before night had a tent erected and 2 bunks put in for Chesney and myself. That day I named the street Wharf Street. A few friends were invited to the opening of our premises, among whom were J. F. Byrne of Corinthian Hall of drapery notoriety, Inspector McTavick, Dan O'Donnell, and as many others as the tent would accommodate. We had a housewarming, spent a pleasant night, and were fit for business the next morning. I lost no time in erecting a store, as had a shipment of timber from Dunedin by the schooner Cumraik, Captain Perkins, and had just started business when bad news of the up-country rush induced me to sell out to Mr. Chesney. As I still had a store at Dunstan Creek, Otago, I went back there, but soon sold out, and within a few months went back again to Hokitika. I bought the store premises at the corner of Wharf and Camp Street in 1866, and as before stated, remained there over 9 years. I took a lively interest in the place, and saw the town grow from a few tents to a very large township. I was there at the time of the Fenian riots, and much against my will was appointed foreman of the jury which tried and convicted the rioters. So I heard the celebrated Victorian barrister, Mr. Ireland, address in the prisoner's favour before Judge Richmond, and the final verdict, a fine of only £20 sterling or 1 month's imprisonment. This riot involved much loss of time and expense to the whole West Coast community. The Riot Act was read, and almost every male member of the community was sworn in as special constables. All public business was suspended for more than a week. Captain MacDonald and his company of Taranaki soldiers were in attendance if required, but finally quietness reigned, and the people settled down again to their daily duties. I spent some years as member of Westland Wasteland Board, and was for a short time a member of the County Council, and for over 3 years captain of the No. 2 Westland Rifles. I also held the position of Managing Director and Honorary Secretary for the Eastern Hohonu and Greenstone Water Race Company up to the time I left the coast. I was also Managing Director of the Westland Steamship and Tug Company up to the time I left the Timaru. While in business on the coast, I supplied goods to customers from Okarito to Westport, and visited the Haast rush aboard the steam tug Titan, Captain Maiken, and a full cargo of diggers and their appliances. This turned out what miners commonly term a shicer. I was also one of the largest shareholders in the Reefton mines, and through them lost the accumulated savings of many previous years. This, to a great extent, decided me to retire from gold mining centres and to try my luck in an agricultural district, so I eventually cast my lot to reside in South Canterbury. I think the Honourable H. L. Michel is about the only man in Hokitika who was in general mercantile business in my day. He and Perry Brothers are well known in Hokitika. Mr. Perry Sr. started the business over 50 years ago in Revel Street, and both of these firms have always borne a first-class business reputation. Mr. Michel was only a boy when he came to Hokitika. I can remember the day the Perry brothers' father and mother were married. A lot of water has been run down the Hokitika River since then. There are very few men now alive on the coast who were there in my day. I well remember all the officials connected with the public offices mentioned by Mr. Evans as I came into communication with them in the course of everyday business. There were many other well-known men of those days whom I met almost daily, such as C. Y. O'Connor, G. Mueller, R. J. Seddon, R. Reeves, Hall and Finlay, William Royce, Honourable J.A. Bonar, Archdeacon Harper, William Perry, Parson, Gow, Father McGeer, Dr. McDermott, Carey and Giles, G.G. Fitzgerald, our resident magistrate, William Keach and Malloy, W.C. Roberts, Bank of New Zealand, Kennedy Brothers, Churches and Ching, T. Pringle, Andrew Mowat, James Craig, E. Prosser, D.W. Virtue, Harry Robinson, William Smith, P. Comiskey, William Todd, Spence Brothers, Duncan McFarlane, G.W. Binney, Mark Sprott, Finlay and Howarth, Thomas Kerr, Andrew Stenhouse, W. McLeavy. Many others I could also name, but they have, with the exception of Archdeacon Harper and William McLeavy, joined the great majority. But in the 1860s and the 70s, the men mentioned above were all well-known businessmen, officials and clergy that any country might well be proud of. I have written these few lines on the sudden impulse after receiving the newspaper which has brought to my mind so many memories of the past. Perhaps at an early date I may again visit the coast. I spent some of the happiest days of my life in Hokitika, and never met as sociable a people anywhere else. Most of them were very successful in business after they left the coast. William Evans. End of section 3. Section 4 of Hokitika, New Zealand. The Birth of a Borough. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Beeswaxcandle. An explorer's impressions of Hokitika, from Sir Julius von Haast's records of his visit in 1865. Sir Julius writes, inter alia, on the morning of April 21st, 1865, we started early for Hokitika along the beach, which, during ebb tide, offers generally fine travelling ground on a hard sandy bottom. The whole way appeared like a great main road rather than an ocean beach. Horses and riders, pack horses and their drivers, men with swags, wagons drawn by horses or bullocks, the whole a picture of earnest activity, proved that we were advancing towards the great centre of the goldfields. At the mouth of the small Waimea River, distant about 5 miles from the Teramako, we found a settlement of small extent, consisting of about 30 shanties and canvas houses, mostly stores and public houses. There the road leaves the coast for the extensive diggings at the head of this creek. A similar but larger township was found at the mouth of the Arahura, which we passed after a march of a few hours. The nearer we approached Hokitika, the more the traffic became animated, and when we at last entered the city of yesterday, we could not conceal our astonishment that, in so short a time of only a few months, such a large place could have sprung up, which, being literally built on sand, seemed at the same time healthy and clean. The principal street, half a mile long, consisted already of a large number of shops, hotels, banks, and dwelling houses, and appeared as a scene of almost indescribable hustle and activity. There were jewellers and watchmakers, physicians and barbers, hotels and billiard rooms, eating and boarding houses, and trades and professions of all descriptions. Everywhere the English language would of course be heard in its principal dialects, as well as German, Italian, Greek, and French, and several other tongues. Carts were unloading and loading, and sheep and cattle driven into the yards. There was shouting and bell-ringing, deafening to the passers-by, criers at every corner of the principal streets, which were filled with people, a scene I had never before witnessed in New Zealand. Hundreds of diggers on the spree, and loafers were everywhere to be seen, but principally near the spit and on the wharf, where work went on with feverish haste. Before arriving at Hokitika, I counted 7 vessels at anchor in the roadstead, amongst them a large Melbourne steamer, whilst in the river itself 5 steamers and a large number of sailing vessels were discharging their cargoes, reminding us of life in a European port. Owing to the shifting nature of the channel, which leads through the surf into the river, several vessels had been stranded, amongst which were 2 steamers. However, one of them, the Stormbird, was that day brought into deep water again. I pitched my tents in the government camp, in which, in canvas houses, the provincial government commissioner, Mr. G. Sale, and the other government officers were living, and which contained also the police camp, jail, and the offices of the resident magistrate and of the goldfields warden. For several days we had quite a deluge of wet weather, as it rained almost incessantly. Soon as the weather had cleared up again, I started for the Waimea goldfields, to which the road was in a most wretched state, owing to the enormous traffic along a swampy forest track, although the government had already begun to corduroy the worst portions. In the evening we reached the Waimea township, for which room had to be made by felling a number of trees in the luxuriant forest, here clothing the whole country. Although surrounded by a large digging population, there was very little loafing to be seen here. Of course, diggers were coming and going, but the whole intercourse had a healthy appearance, and showed that its mining population was busily engaged on its claims. During several days I visited all the principal diggings in the neighbourhood, making myself acquainted with the mode of occurrence of the precious metal, and following the main branches of the Waimea to near their sources. I also went to Fox's Rush, and some other goldfields on Fox's and Red Jack's gullies, falling into the Arahura. Afterwards I proceeded to the source of the Kapatea, and visited Callahan's and German creeks, and some others in the neighbourhood, and thus obtained an insight into the nature and extent of the goldfields in that part of the west coast. I may state that the whole goldfields, as far as visited, were found to be deposits of a very large river of pre-glacial age, those portions being only preserved which had not been reached during the great glacier period of New Zealand by the advancing gigantic glaciers, or by the enormous torrents issuing from them. The next stage was to Greymouth, which showed signs of wonderfully rapid progress. 5 years ago I had camped on this spot in solitude, with no European excepting 3 companions near me for 100 miles, and only a few Maori whares in my neighbourhood. And now rows of large houses were built, and a busy life gave signs of healthy progress all around. Several days were devoted to a visit of the grey coal measures, where I found a hearty reception from the manager of the coal mine on the Nelson side. Returning to Hokitika on the 9th May, I examined, on my way, several claims on the sea beach, which appeared remunerative, and which would thus offer additional ground for a great number of diggers without any additional outlay. Intending to ascend the Hokitika and its tributary, the Kanieri, I obtained, not without trouble, a canoe from the Maoris, which I had to pay £2 sterling a week. They had soon fallen into the European way of charging goldfield prices. Leaving the town of Hokitika next day and ascending the river, we had to cross several shingle reaches where the water formed rapids, before we arrived at the small township of Kanieri, at the junction of Kanieri River, and where I remained a day studying the interesting and instructive occurrence of gold. The numerous shafts sunk in the township itself, and all around it, gave me a clear insight into the manner in which the auriferous beds had been formed. On the following morning we had for a few miles a delightful paddle up the still and deep brown water of the Kanieri Creek, dammed back by the shingle bank the Hokitika has thrown across it at its junction. This passed, its course became very winding, rapid succeeded rapid, which to ascend gave us considerable trouble, whilst a number of large trees fallen across the water obstructed our passage considerably. We reached at last a spot about 5 miles above the junction, where further ascent was impossible, and where considerable mining operations, the so-called 5-mile diggings, were in progress. Here, as at the Kanieri township, the wash dirt had very often been protected by younger morainic accumulations covering it, and have thus been preserved from destruction. At this place again I was detained by continuous rain for about a week, but our camping ground was so well sheltered that we never felt any wind, whilst, as I heard afterwards, a fearful storm had been raging along the coast, houses having been blown away at Hokitika and other settlements, and several vessels, amongst them the steamer Waipara, having been wrecked not far from the mouth of the Hokitika River. On May 21st we were at last able to continue our journey, and reached in the evening the shores of Lake Kanieri, Having travelled the greater part of the day over terraces, mostly swampy, the ground covered with sphagma, of which the principal vegetation consisted of Hokitika, totara, and manuka, mixed with Phylacladus alpinus and kawaka, Libocedrus donianus. But all the trees were small and had a rather stunted appearance. But in the gorges of the tributary streams or along the banks of the river bed, the forest vegetation was very luxuriant and magnificent, the presence of large arborescent ferns adding considerably to the beauty of the scenery. Lake Canieri, although small, being about 5 miles long by 2 miles broad, is a very picturesque piece of water, as it is surrounded on 3 sides by high mountains with bold outlines, the lower portions being covered with luxuriant forest. It owes its origin to a large semicircular terminal moraine which crosses the valley from side to side, and through which its outlet has cut a passage. A low saddle is conspicuous near its upper end, leading into the upper Hokitika plains, where several roches moutonnées on both sides show distinctly that a portion of Canieri Glacier had here joined the extensive Hokitika Glacier during our Great Glacier period. Returning to Hokitika for a fresh stock of provisions, we started again on May 25th to ascend this time the main river, visiting first the Woodstock diggings on the left bank, where I observed a geological structure of the gold-bearing beds similar to that of the Canieri Township deposits. The river presented a very animated scene, a number of boats and canoes ascending and descending. Tent houses and small settlements peeped in many spots from amongst the fine forest vegetation which clothed the banks on both sides, whilst in still more numerous localities the smoke curling above the tree-tops betrayed the existence of human habitations. The weather was now very fine, and the view up the river upon the high mountain chains, rising abruptly at the end of the plains, exceedingly beautiful. The dark green vegetation ascending for several thousand feet and contrasting strikingly with the pure white garment of snow with which the higher portions of the ranges were uniformly covered. Near the junction of the Kokotahi, the Hokitika turns abruptly to the southwest and changes its character, becoming, for more than a mile, a deep, slow-flowing river, the shingle deposits of its smaller but more rapid tributary having dammed the waters of the main river back to a considerable extent. Its left bank consists of large morainic accumulations, covered with forest vegetation, the right bank being low and covered with shrubs and ferns. The landscape has now undergone considerable change. A wide plain, mostly covered with veronica, olearia, coprosma, leptospermum, and coriaria bushes, stretching to the high mountains. In the midst rises an isolated range, called Te Koi Itarangi, about 800 feet high, which has a roche moutonnées-like appearance. Some others, of which one has the form of a regular cone, stand at the foot of the outrunning spurs of the high ranges which bound the horizon. We now left the busy abode of the mining population and entered the solitude, although many trial shafts along the riverbed and afterwards along the high banks near the Hokitika Gorge proved that numerous prospecting parties had tried their fortune in many localities without obtaining the desired results. An attack of fever, no doubt caused by being continually in wet clothes, kept me here for several days in the same camp. However, owing to the use of some strong doses of quinine, I soon felt much better and was able on May the 30th to reach the foot of the ranges, where the river enters the plain in a deep gorge, the vertical or overhanging walls on both sides of which consist of gneiss granite. The water in this gorge was so deep that we could nowhere find the bottom with the large pole we had in the canoe, and there was no perceptible flow. Passing through this really fine gorge, about half a mile long, we found the riverbed above it so rough and full of large blocks of stones and the water so rapid that we could not take the canoe any higher. We therefore continued our journey on foot for some distance, to enable me to examine the geological structure of the district. In every prospect we obtained gold, but it occurred in such small quantities that it would not pay for its extraction by the mining processes now in use. A wild mountain landscape surrounded us here, and as the river was flowing in a nearly straight valley for a considerable distance, the eye could not follow the outline of the spurs which appeared behind each other. those most distant getting generally higher and more rugged. Heavy rain set in again, which, however, did not prevent me from returning to Hokitika. And we reached it, owing to the swollen state of the river, in about 3 hours and a half, having been 3 days ascending to the same camp. My 2 Maori companions had here ample opportunity to show their skill in guiding the canoe through all the obstacles in our way, of which drift trees are the most dangerous, but which they accomplished most successfully. I have not alluded to the fine and extensive mountain view visible from the sea beach at Hokitika, and which stretches from the mountains in the north to the Hooker Range in the south. A chain of wooded mountains situated between the Totara and Wanganui rivers, their outrunning spurs nearly reaching the sea, are prominent in the south. They are about 2,000 or 3,000 feet high, wooded to the summit, and form a very interesting feature in the landscape. Above them rise, conspicuously, the highest summits of the Southern Alps, Mount Beaumont, Mount de la Beche, Mount Heidinger, Mount Tasman, Mount Cook, Mount Stokes, and the Moorhouse Range. In very clear weather, other snowy mountains show above the horizon of the sea, but often so faintly that very often they may easily be mistaken for white clouds. End of section 4. End of Hokitika, New Zealand, The Birth of a Borough, by David John Evans, Samuel Saunders, et al.